You've started before. You know you have. The workout plan that lasted 11 days. The budget that survived 2 weeks. The morning routine that made it to the end of the month before the alarm started getting snoozed and then moved and then turned off entirely. The side project that burned bright for 3 weeks and then sat untouched for 3 months and then got deleted in a moment of quiet shame. The journal that has 12 entries. The course that's 17% complete. The language app with a 200-day streak that ended on a Tuesday and never restarted. You've started 100 things. You finished almost none of them, and every time you quit, the same story plays. You weren't motivated enough. You didn't want it badly enough. You lacked discipline. You lacked willpower. You lack the fire, the hunger, the relentless drive that separates the people who succeed from the people who start and stop and start and stop until they stop starting altogether. So you go looking for motivation. You watch the video, you read the quote, you listen to the speech. The guy on stage is screaming about grinding and never giving up and being a lion among sheep and waking up at 4 in the morning and wanting it as badly as you want to breathe. And you feel it. For about 45 minutes you feel it. The energy, the certainty, the conviction that this time will be different. This time you'll push through. This time you won't quit. And then you quit, again. And the shame is worse this time because you had the motivation, you found it, you consumed it, you felt it in your chest, and it still wasn't enough. Which can only mean one thing. There's something wrong with you, something fundamentally broken in the part of you that's supposed to follow through. Something that motivation can't fix because you've had the motivation and it didn't work. There's nothing wrong with you. The motivation model is wrong. Motivation is not the fuel that produces sustained action. It's the spark. And a spark without a fire structure produces a flash and then nothing. You don't need a bigger spark. You need to understand why the structure keeps collapsing, why the pattern repeats. Why the quitting happens at predictable points in predictable ways for predictable reasons that have nothing to do with how badly you want the outcome, and everything to do with how the human brain processes effort, reward, discomfort, and identity. This audiobook examines the quitting pattern, not to shame you for it, to disassemble it, to show you the specific mechanisms that produce the quit, the specific moments where the pattern activates, and the specific structural changes that prevent the pattern from completing its cycle. 5 chapters. Why motivation fails. The anatomy of quitting. The 3 walls everyone hits. The identity problem nobody talks about. And how to build systems that don't require motivation to function. 1 hour, no screaming, no grinding, no lions, just the architecture of follow-through. Let's build it. Chapter 1. Why motivation fails, the spark and the structure. Motivation is an emotional state. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that the entire motivational industry is built on. The industry treats motivation as a resource, something you can accumulate, something you can store, something you can deploy on demand when the effort gets difficult. Find enough motivation and you'll push through anything. Feel the motivation deeply enough and no obstacle can stop you. The speeches, the videos, the books, the podcasts, the social media accounts with their daily doses of inspirational content, all of them are selling motivation as if it were a durable resource like money in a bank account. Deposit enough and you can withdraw it when you need it. But motivation doesn't work like a bank account. It works like an emotion, like anger, like excitement, like the rush of falling in love. It arrives uninvited, it burns intensely, and it fades on a timeline that you do not control. The motivational speech produces a spike of emotional intensity. The spike is real. The feelings are genuine. The resolve is authentic in the moment you feel it, but the spike has a half-life, and the half-life is short, hours, maybe a day, rarely more than a week. The emotional intensity that made you feel unstoppable on Monday has degraded to a faint memory by Thursday. And by Thursday, the alarm goes off and the workout seems less important and the budget feels restrictive and the side project feels overwhelming. And the voice that said, "This time is different," has gone quiet, and the voice that says, "Maybe tomorrow," has taken its place. This is crucial. The fade isn't weakness. It isn't a character defect. It isn't evidence that you don't want the goal enough. It's neurochemistry. The emotional spike of motivation is driven by a temporary increase in dopamine and norepinephrine, your brain's reward and alertness. As chemicals, the increase is real, but it's temporary by design. Your brain doesn't maintain elevated neurochemical states indefinitely. It can't. Sustained elevation of dopamine and norepinephrine would be neurologically damaging. The brain self-regulates. The chemicals return to baseline. And when the chemicals return to baseline, the emotional state that depended on them returns to baseline too. The motivation fades, not because you're broken, because your brain is functioning correctly. The fade is the feature, not the bug. Most people miss this about why the motivational industry is structured the way it is, and why it will never solve your problem. The industry doesn't sell you a solution. It sells you a spike. And the spike fades by neurochemical design, which means you need another spike, which means you need another video, another speech, another book, another podcast episode, another dose. The motivational industry's business model depends on the temporary nature of motivation, the way the pharmaceutical industry's business model depends on the chronic nature of disease. If motivation lasted, you'd only need one speech, one video, one book. You'd consume it, transform your life, and never need the industry again. The industry would sell you a single product and cease to exist. But motivation doesn't last. So the industry sells you the spike on a recurring basis. Daily motivation. Weekly motivation. The morning dose. The evening reminder. The subscription to the app that delivers inspiration to your phone at 6 a.m. so you can start each day with a fresh spike that will fade by noon and need replacing by tomorrow morning. The industry isn't failing to solve your problem. It's profiting from the problem's persistence. It's selling you the spark over and over while never mentioning the structure that would make the spark unnecessary. Because if you built the structure, you'd stop buying sparks. And the industry needs you buying sparks the way the consumer economy needs you buying products. The transaction is the point, not the transformation. The structure alternative. If motivation is the spark, then what is the structure? The structure is the set of conditions, habits, environmental designs, and pre-planned responses that make the desired behavior the default behavior regardless of your current emotional state, regardless of whether you feel inspired, regardless of whether you watched the video, regardless of whether the fire is burning in your chest or the fire went out 3 days ago. And all that remains is the cold morning. and the alarm and the knowledge that you don't feel like doing the thing. The person who works out consistently doesn't work out because they feel motivated every morning. They don't leap out of bed with burning desire and sprint to the gym accompanied by a mental soundtrack of inspirational music. They work out because the gym bag is packed by the door from the night before. The alarm is set for a time that includes no decision space. The gym is on the route to work, so the detour costs nothing. And the decision to exercise was made once, structurally, embedded into the architecture of the morning, rather than being remade every single morning against the resistance of a brain that would prefer sleep, warmth, comfort, and the path of least energy expenditure. The decision was made once when the person was thinking clearly, and the structure executes the decision daily, so the person never has to make it again in the compromised state of a groggy, reluctant, unmotivated morning. The person who saves money consistently doesn't save because they feel inspired to save. They don't open their banking app with a surge of financial enthusiasm. They save because the automatic transfer was set up once, and the money moves on payday before they see it, before they feel it, before the consumption system can intercept it. And the decision to save was embedded in the architecture of their financial life, rather than being dependent on a daily, weekly, or monthly act of willpower that would need to overcome the wanting machine described in the previous audiobook every single time. Structure doesn't need motivation. Structure replaces motivation. It takes the decision out of the emotional realm where motivation operates and embeds it in the environmental and systemic realm where architecture operates. And the difference between people who follow through and people who quit is almost never the amount of motivation they possess, almost never the intensity of their desire, almost never the strength of their willpower or the depth of their character. It's the quality of the structure they've built around the behavior they want to sustain. The people who follow through built the fire structure before lighting the spark. The people who quit lit the spark and hoped it would build its own structure. It never does. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of Quitting. What actually happens when you stop. Quitting doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, and the stages are remarkably consistent regardless of what you're quitting. The workout plan, the budget, the side project, the morning routine, the diet, the creative practice, the study habit. The content changes. The quitting pattern is the same. And understanding the stages means you can see the quit approaching before it arrives and intervene at the specific point where intervention is still possible. Stage 1. The honeymoon. This is the first week to 3 weeks. Everything is new. The novelty itself produces dopamine. The brain rewards new experiences because new experiences historically indicated new resources, new territories, new survival advantages. The workout feels exciting because the exercises are unfamiliar. The budget feels empowering because the categories are fresh and the tracking is novel. The side project feels electric because the ideas are flowing and the possibilities feel unlimited. During the honeymoon, you don't need motivation. The novelty provides it automatically. You feel like you've finally found the thing, the plan, the approach, the answer. This time is different, except the feeling that this time is different is itself part of the pattern. You felt it last time too, and the time before that. Stage 2. The dip. This is week 3 to week 8. The novelty has worn off. The dopamine reward from newness has faded because there is no more newness. The exercises are now familiar and the familiarity is boring. The budget is no longer an exciting new project, and the categories that felt empowering now feel like walls closing in. The side project has hit its first real obstacle, not the fun kind of obstacle that makes you feel like a hero for overcoming it. The tedious kind that requires you to redo work you thought was finished or learn something you didn't think you'd need to learn. The gap between where you are and where you want to be, which was invisible during the honeymoon because the excitement was louder than the distance, is now fully visible, and it looks enormous. The destination that seemed achievable when the motivation was flowing now looks impossibly far away when the motivation has dried up, and all that remains is the daily grind of showing up and doing the work. The dip is where most people quit, not because the goal is impossible, not because the behavior is too hard, not because they made the wrong choice, because the emotional fuel that started the journey has been consumed, and the structure that would sustain the journey through the fuel-less phase was never built. The dip is the structural test, and most people fail the test not because they're weak, but because nobody told them the test was coming. Nobody told them that every sustained effort in human history passes through a phase where the excitement dies and the progress slows, and the only thing keeping you going is the structure you built before the dip arrived. They thought the excitement was supposed to last. It never does. This is crucial. The dip is predictable. It arrives at roughly the same point in every sustained effort regardless of the domain. Exercise, finance, creativity, learning, relationship building, career change, business development, language acquisition. The timing varies slightly, but the mechanism is identical every time. The novelty reward expires because the brain has already mapped the new territory and the mapping is no longer novel. The effort cost remains because the behavior still requires energy, still requires time, still requires you to choose the harder option over the easier one. And the brain, which has been optimizing for energy conservation since before your ancestors walked upright, calculates that the energy being spent on this new behavior is not producing a proportional return. The calculation is correct in the short term. In the short term, the behavior is all cost and no visible benefit. The long-term benefits, the fitness, the financial stability, the skill, the creative body of work, the fluency, have not yet materialized. They won't materialize for months or years. But the brain doesn't operate on months and years. It operates on the immediate present. And right now, in this moment, the behavior costs energy and produces nothing but discomfort and boredom and the acute, pressing awareness of how far you still have to go. Stage 3, the negotiation. This is where the quitting actually happens, but it doesn't look like quitting. Not yet, not on the surface. It looks like rationalization. It sounds like wisdom. It feels like maturity. You don't say, "I quit." That would be too honest. That would trigger the shame that the brain is trying to avoid. Instead, you say, "I'll take a day off. I've earned it." You say, "I'll start fresh on Monday, a clean slate." You say, "I need to rethink my approach. Maybe this method isn't optimal for me." You say, "Maybe this isn't the right time, a lot going on." You say, I should focus on other priorities right now. This can wait. Each of these statements sounds reasonable. Each one sounds rational. Each one sounds like something a thoughtful, self-aware person would say. And each one is the brain's negotiation strategy for exiting the uncomfortable behavior without the shame of admitting that you quit. The brain isn't lying to you exactly. It's constructing a narrative that makes the exit feel like a decision rather than a defeat. And the construction is so skilled, so seamless, so persuasive, that you don't recognize it as the quitting mechanism in action. You believe you're making a reasonable choice. You're not. You're executing stage 3 of a 4-stage pattern that has played out identically in every previous attempt. The negotiation stage is the most dangerous because it doesn't feel like quitting. It feels like wisdom, like flexibility, like the kind of self-compassion the wellness industry tells you to practice. And because it feels reasonable, you don't resist it. You accept the negotiation. You take the day off. The day becomes 3 days because the habit loop has been interrupted and the brain has already begun reclassifying the behavior from ongoing commitment to thing I used to do. The 3 days become a week. The week becomes 2 weeks. The 2 weeks become the silent, gradual abandonment that you never officially acknowledged because you never officially quit. You just stopped. Gradually, reasonably, wisely, the way you always stop. Most people miss this about why the negotiation stage is where intervention must happen. By the time you've accepted the negotiation, the behavior is already dead. It just hasn't been buried yet. The intervention has to happen before the negotiation begins, which means it has to happen in the dip, when the novelty is gone and the discomfort is present and the brain is calculating that the effort isn't worth the return. That's the moment. The moment where the structure either carries you through or the absence of structure allows the brain to begin its exit strategy. Stage 4, the rewrite. After the quitting is complete, the brain rewrites the story. You didn't quit because the structure failed. You quit because the goal wasn't right for you, because the timing was wrong, because you realized you wanted something different, because the approach didn't suit your personality. The rewrite is psychologically necessary because the brain protects the self-concept. You can't see yourself as someone who quits, so the brain constructs a narrative in which you didn't quit. You redirected, you reassessed, you evolved, and the rewrite is so convincing that by the time the next goal appears, you've forgotten the pattern entirely. You approach the new goal with the same structureless motivation that failed last time and the cycle begins again. Honeymoon, dip, negotiation, rewrite, repeat. Chapter 3, the 3 walls, where everyone gets stuck. Within the dip, there are 3 specific experiences that trigger the negotiation stage. 3 walls that virtually everyone hits in virtually every sustained effort. Understanding the walls doesn't make them disappear, but it does make them recognizable. And a wall you can see approaching is a wall you can prepare for rather than a wall that hits you blind. Wall 1, the boredom wall. Somewhere between week 3 and week 6, the behavior becomes boring, not hard, not impossible, not painful, not overwhelming, boring. The exercises are the same ones you did last week and the week before that. The budget categories haven't changed, and the act of tracking expenses has become as exciting as watching paint dry. The language lessons are drilling vocabulary you've already seen. conjugating verbs you've already conjugated, repeating phrases you've already repeated, until the repetition itself feels like punishment. The side project is in the tedious middle phase where the exciting ideation is over, and the glamorous completion is nowhere in sight. And what remains is the repetitive, unglamorous, detail-oriented work of building, something one brick at a time, where each individual brick looks exactly like the last one, and the wall you're building is still only knee-high. Boredom is the first wall because the modern brain has been systematically trained for stimulation. Social media delivers a new piece of content every 3 seconds. Streaming platforms offer unlimited novelty at the press of a button. The smartphone in your pocket is an infinite novelty machine that can deliver a fresh dopamine hit faster than you can blink. The entire attention economy has tuned your dopamine system to expect constant, effortless, uninterrupted novelty. And a brain tuned for constant novelty interprets boredom as a signal, not a neutral signal, an alarm signal, a signal that something is wrong, that the activity isn't working, that you've made a mist. Ache, that you should pivot, switch, redirect, find something more engaging, more stimulating, more aligned with the kind of person you are, which is a person who does exciting things, not boring, repetitive things. But the signal is false. Boredom isn't evidence that the activity is wrong. It's evidence that you've passed the novelty phase and entered the competence-building phase. And the competence-building phase is supposed to be boring. That's what building a skill or a habit or a financial foundation or a creative body of work actually feels like from the inside when the cameras aren't rolling and the motivational music isn't playing. It feels like repetition. It feels like doing the same thing again, and again, and again, with small variations, small improvements, small increments of progress that are invisible on any given day, but that accumulate over weeks and months into the competence that the novelty phase could never produce. This is crucial. The boredom wall eliminates most people not because they can't handle difficulty, but because they've never been taught that boredom is a stage in the process, not a verdict on the activity. The modern interpretation of boredom is, this isn't for me, I should find something I'm more passionate about. The accurate interpretation is, the easy part is over and the actual building has started, and the building phase feels exactly like this for everyone. Every expert in every field passed through the boredom wall. Every fit person got bored with the exercises and did them anyway. Every financially stable person got bored with the budget and tracked their spending anyway. Every fluent speaker got bored with the vocabulary drills and drilled anyway. The wall didn't mean they were doing the wrong thing. It meant they were doing the right thing long enough for it to stop being entertaining and start being effective. The boredom wall is the entrance exam for competence, and most people mistake it for a stop sign because nobody told them. It was an exam, and nobody told them that passing it requires nothing more than continuing. Wall 2, the plateau wall. Somewhere between week 8 and week 16, progress becomes invisible. You've been consistent. Maybe you powered through the boredom wall. You found the variation. You stuck with the routine. And for a while, the effort was producing visible, measurable, undeniable results. The numbers on the scale moved. The side project took shape. The savings account grew by an amount you could see and feel. The vocabulary expanded enough to understand a simple conversation. The progress was the reward. It justified the effort. It told the brain that the energy expenditure was producing a return. But then the visible progress stopped. The scale doesn't move for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The measurements that were changing have stabilized. The side project feels stuck at the same stage, the same problems recurring, the same obstacles refusing to yield. The savings account grows by the same predictable amount, but the number no longer produces the excitement it produced when saving was new. The language feels the same. You're putting in the same effort, the same hours, the same energy. And the effort isn't producing the visible reward that kept you going during the early progress phase. You're running on the treadmill described in the previous audiobooks, but now the treadmill isn't even pretending to move forward. The plateau is where survivors of the boredom wall often quit. They proved they could handle the repetition. They proved they could push through the loss of novelty. But the plateau asks something different. The boredom wall asks, can you keep going when it's not exciting? The plateau wall asks, can you keep going when it doesn't seem to be working? Most people miss this about why the plateau wall is so devastating even for people who survive the boredom wall. The brain evaluates effort through a cost-benefit calculation that runs continuously in the background. During the visible progress phase, the cost of the effort was justified by the benefit of the visible result. The number going down on the scale, the project growing by measurable increments, the balance increasing in the savings account. The brain registered the reward and approved the continued expenditure of energy. The calculation said effort equals progress, and the approval sustained the behavior. But during the plateau, the cost continues while the visible benefit disappears. The brain's calculation flips. The effort now appears to be producing nothing. And an effort that produces nothing is an effort the brain wants to terminate because the brain's job is to conserve energy, and an energy expenditure with no return is the definition of waste. What the brain doesn't account for, what it cannot account for because it lacks access to the data, is that progress during the plateau is happening beneath the surface. The muscles are adapting in ways the scale can't measure because the body is recomposing, replacing fat with muscle that weighs the same, but occupies less space and performs differently. The neural pathways are consolidating in ways the vocabulary quiz can't capture because the brain is building the deep structures that will enable fluency rather than the surface recognition that quizzes measure. The business foundation is being built in ways that won't be visible until the next growth phase begins because foundations are invisible until something is built on top of them. The plateau is not the absence of progress, it's invisible progress. Progress happening in the substrate rather than on the surface. But the brain can't see invisible progress. It can only see the cost, and the cost, without the visible reward, triggers the negotiation stage. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe I need a different approach. Maybe I should take a break and reassess. The negotiation begins. And unless the system has a protocol for this specific moment, the negotiation ends the way it always ends. Wall 3. The identity wall. This is the deepest wall and the one that almost nobody talks about. The identity wall appears when the behavior you're trying to sustain conflicts with your internal self-concept. You're trying to become a person who exercises regularly, but your identity, the deep story you tell yourself about who you are, says you're not an athlete. You're not a fitness person. You're the person who starts things and stops them. You're the person who means well but can't follow through. The identity wall isn't about boredom or plateaus. It's about the brain defending its existing model of who you are against evidence that would require updating that model. Here's what actually happens when you hit the identity wall. Your behavior has been changing. You've been exercising, or saving, or building, or learning consistently for long enough that the behavior is beginning to challenge your self-concept. You're acting like a person who exercises, but you don't believe you are a person who exercises. The gap between the behavior and the belief creates cognitive dissonance, and the brain resolves cognitive dissonance by changing either the behavior or the belief. Changing the belief requires rewriting your identity. Rewriting your identity is psychologically expensive. Changing the behavior, quitting, is psychologically cheap. So the brain chooses the cheap option. You quit. Not because the behavior was too hard, not because the goal was wrong, because continuing would have required you to become someone new. And the brain, protective of the existing identity, regardless of whether that identity serves you, chose to preserve who you were over who you were becoming. Chapter 4. The Identity Problem: Why You Keep Becoming Who You Were. The identity wall deserves its own chapter because it's the wall that the motivational industry never addresses. Motivation is aimed at behavior. Get up, grind, push through, do the thing. But behavior that contradicts identity is always temporary. Always. You can force behavior against identity for days, weeks, sometimes months. But the identity always wins eventually, because the identity is the brain's model of reality. And the brain defends its model of reality against contradictory evidence with extraordinary persistence. The self-concept loop. Your identity is not a fixed truth about who you are. It feels fixed. It feels permanent. It feels like bedrock. But it's not. It's a story. A narrative constructed from past experiences, reinforced by repeated behaviors, and maintained by the brain's powerful, constant need for internal consistency. The brain needs the story to be stable because a stable identity reduces the cognitive cost of decision-making. If you know who you are, you don't have to deliberate every choice from scratch. The identity provides the template. I'm someone who, and the brain fills in the rest based on the accumulated data. If you've quit 14 times, the brain has constructed an identity around someone who quits, not because quitting is your nature, not because there's a quitting gene or a quitting character type, because the brain uses past behavior as the primary data set for predicting future behavior. And 14 quits is a powerful data set. 14 data points all pointing in the same direction. The brain has drawn the trend line. The trend line says, this person starts things and doesn't finish them. And the identity, once constructed, becomes self-maintaining, not passive, active. The identity creates the conditions that confirm it. Here's how the loop operates. The identity says, I'm someone who starts and quits. This identity reduces your investment in the next attempt. Why build an elaborate system? Why design the environment? Why plan for the walls? For a behavior you'll probably abandon in 3 weeks. The question isn't asked consciously. It operates beneath awareness as a reduction in effort, a reduction in planning, a reduction in the structural investment that would be necessary to carry the behavior through the dip. The underinvestment produces the structural failure described in chapters 2 and 3. The structural failure produces the quit. The quit adds another data point to the identity model. The identity model strengthens. The prediction becomes more confident. The underinvestment in the next attempt becomes more pronounced. The next quit becomes more probable, and the cycle repeats. Each rotation making the identity more solid, more resistant to change, more deeply embedded in the brain's model of who you are. This is crucial. The self-concept loop means that your quitting history is not just a record of past events. It's an active force shaping present decisions. Every time you quit, the brain adds a data point to the identity model. Every data point makes the model stronger. Every stronger model makes the next quit more likely. Your past failures are not behind you. They are inside you, operating in real time, reducing the probability of your current success through the mechanism of reduced investment, driven by reduced expectation. And the motivational industry's response to this loop is catastrophically wrong. The industry says, believe in yourself. You can do anything. Your past doesn't define your future. This time is different. These statements are emotionally appealing and psychologically ineffective because the identity model doesn't respond to affirmations. It doesn't update based on what you tell yourself. It responds to evidence, observable behavioral evidence. You can stand in front of a mirror and tell yourself you're someone who follows through. But the brain has 14 data points that say otherwise. And the brain trusts the data over the affirmation every single time without exception. The affirmation bounces off the identity model like a pebble off a tank. The data penetrates because data is the language the identity model speaks. The identity update requirement. If the identity model responds to evidence rather than affirmation, the solution is to provide evidence. Not massive evidence. Not I completed a marathon on my first attempt evidence. Not I saved $50,000 in 6 months evidence. The identity model doesn't require dramatic evidence. It requires consistent evidence. Small, repeated, daily evidence that contradicts the existing model one data point at a time. You don't need to exercise for an hour to provide evidence that you're someone who exercises. You need to put on the shoes. Walk to the gym or the park or the living room. Do 5 minutes. 5 actual minutes of actual movement. Go home. That's a data point. A tiny one. Insignificant by any performance standard, but the brain registers it. The identity model receives it. And the model, which updates based on accumulated evidence, adds the data point to the set. Tomorrow, another 5 minutes, another data point, and the next day, and the next. Each micro-behavior is a vote for the new identity, not a resolution, not a commitment, not a screaming declaration of transformation posted on social media for accountability that's really just performance. A vote. A quiet, small, undramatic piece of evidence that the brain adds to the data set alongside the 14 quits. And over time, weeks and months of accumulated microevidence, the data set shifts. The 14 quits are still there. They don't disappear, but they're now accompanied by 30 data points, then 60, then 90. The trend line, which pointed definitively toward quitting, begins to bend. The identity model updates, not because you told it to update, because you showed it something new, something it couldn't argue with, something it had to incorporate. And the brain trusts what it's shown over what it's told. Always has, always will. Most people miss this about why small behaviors are more powerful than dramatic commitments for identity change. The dramatic commitment, the New Year's resolution, the public declaration, the all-in transformation, activates the identity wall at full force. The gap between who you are today and who the commitment says you'll become is enormous. The brain registers the gap as a threat to the existing identity and mobilizes its defenses. The resistance is proportional to the size of the declared change. But the micro-behavior doesn't trigger the identity wall because it's too small to register as a threat. 5 minutes of exercise doesn't threaten the identity of someone who doesn't exercise. It's so small it slides under the radar. And by the time the brain notices that the accumulated micro-behaviors have shifted the data set, the new identity has already begun forming. The wall was never hit because the approach was small enough to go around it. Chapter 5, The System That Doesn't Need Motivation, BUILDI. NG, The Architecture of Follow-Through. You now understand why motivation fails, why quitting follows a predictable 4-stage pattern, why 3 specific walls appear at predictable points, and why identity, not willpower, determines whether behavior persists or collapses. The question is what to build instead. What architecture produces sustained action without depending on the emotional spike that the motivational industry sells and that your neurochemistry degrades within days? The answer is a system, not a goal. A system. Goals are endpoints. Systems are processes. Goals say, I want to lose 30 pounds. Systems say, I eat this way at these times and move this way at these times regardless of how I feel. Goals require motivation because they focus attention on the gap between where you are and where you want to be, and the gap is demoralizing. Systems require only compliance because they focus attention on the next action rather than the distant outcome. The next action is small. The next action is manageable. The next action doesn't require emotional intensity. It requires a structure that makes the action the default. Component 1. The environment design. Your environment is stronger than your willpower. Always. In every contest between environmental cue and personal intention, the environment wins. Not sometimes. Not usually. Every single time over a long enough timeline. The person who keeps junk food in the kitchen will eat junk food regardless of their commitment to healthy eating because the environmental cue, the visibility of the food, the proximity of the food, the zero-effort accessibility of the food, is more powerful than the intention formed in a moment of clarity 3 days ago. The person who keeps their phone on the nightstand will scroll before sleeping regardless of their commitment to better sleep hygiene, because the device is there, glowing, familiar, and reaching for it requires zero effort, while not reaching for it requires active resistance against a habit loop that has been reinforced thousands of times. Willpower is a limited resource that degrades across the day. Environmental cues are permanent features that operate at full strength every moment. The contest isn't close, and the people who appear to have extraordinary willpower usually don't. They have extraordinary environments. Environments they designed deliberately to make the desired behavior the path of least resistance, and the undesired behavior the path of most resistance. Designing the environment means arranging the physical and digital spaces of your life so that the behavior you want is the easiest option, and the behavior you don't want requires additional steps, additional effort, additional friction. Remove the friction from the desired behavior. The gym bag packed and placed by the door removes the friction of preparation. The healthy food at eye level in the refrigerator removes the friction of searching. The writing document open on the computer when you sit down removes the friction of starting. Add friction to the undesired behavior. The phone charging in another room adds friction to the scroll. The credit card frozen in a block of ice adds friction to the impulse purchase. The streaming app logged out and requiring a password each time adds friction to the binge. Each environmental adjustment is small, trivial, almost embarrassingly simple. Together, they create an infrastructure that nudges behavior in the desired direction continuously, silently, without requiring a single motivational speech, a single act of willpower, or a single morning where you wake up feeling inspired. The environment does the work. You just live in the environment you designed. Component 2. The minimum viable action. This is the identity updating mechanism from Chapter 4 embedded in the daily system. Define the absolute minimum version of the behavior you want to sustain, not the ideal version, not the impressive version. The minimum version that still counts as doing the thing. 5 minutes of exercise, 1 paragraph of writing, $10 saved, 1 page of reading, 1 sales call. The minimum viable action serves 2 purposes. First, it's small enough to complete even on your worst day, which means the streak never breaks, which means the brain never gets the quit data point that would reinforce the old identity. Second, the minimum often becomes the gateway to more. You said you'd do 5 minutes and you end up doing 30. Not because you were motivated, because you were already doing it and momentum carried you forward. But even when the minimum stays the minimum is enough. Because the minimum updates the identity, and the identity, updated daily by the accumulation of micro-evidence, is what sustains the behavior across months and years. This is crucial. The minimum viable action is not laziness, it's strategic. The motivational approach says go all in, give 100%, do the maximum every day. And the maximum works during the honeymoon, but the maximum becomes unsustainable during the dip, and the unsustainable effort produces the quit that confirms the old identity. The minimum viable action survives the dip because it's designed for the dip. It's not the amount of effort you choose on your best day. It's the amount of effort that remains possible on your worst day. And a behavior that survives your worst day is a behavior that the brain begins to classify as permanent, as identity, as who you are. Component 3. The wall protocol. You now know the 3 walls. The boredom wall around week 4. The plateau wall around week 10. The identity wall whenever the behavior challenges your self-concept. The wall protocol is the pre-planned response to each wall, decided in advance when your cognition is clear rather than improvised in the moment when your brain is actively searching for an exit. For the boredom wall, the protocol is variation within the system, not changing the goal, not switching to something new, adding small variations to the existing behavior that provide enough novelty to satisfy the dopamine system without abandoning the underlying practice. Different exercises within the same workout framework. A different savings challenge within the same budget structure. A different project within the same creative practice. Variation within the system, not escape from the system. For the plateau wall, the protocol is measurement shift. When the primary metric stops moving, start tracking secondary metrics. The scale isn't moving, but the measurements are changing. Track the measurements. The side project isn't growing, but the skills are developing. Track the skills. The savings rate is flat, but the net worth is shifting. Track the net worth. The measurement shift doesn't change the reality. It changes what the brain is using to evaluate cost versus benefit. And new metrics often reveal the invisible progress that the old metric was hiding. For the identity wall, the protocol is the micro-evidence strategy from Chapter 4. Reduce the behavior to the minimum viable action. Remove the threat to the existing identity. Let the accumulated evidence do the updating, rather than trying to force a dramatic identity transformation that the brain will resist. Component 4. The accountability structure. Your brain is remarkably skilled at negotiating with itself. The negotiation stage from the quitting anatomy operates entirely inside your own head, where the brain is both the negotiator and the decision maker. Accountability introduces an external element that disrupts the internal negotiation, not a punishment system, not a drill sergeant. A person or a group that expects your behavior to continue, and whose expectation creates a social cost for quitting that the brain factors into its calculation. The brain that weighs quit and feel relief against quit and disappoint someone who is expecting my update tomorrow makes a different calculation than the brain weighing quit and feel relief against nothing. The accountability doesn't need to be intense. A weekly check-in with a friend who's pursuing a similar goal, a shared tracking document, a group that meets regularly and expects each member to report their progress. The social expectation provides just enough external weight to tip the brain's calculation during the moments when the internal motivation has faded and the negotiation stage is beginning. Here's what actually happens when someone replaces the motivational approach with the systems approach. The first month looks identical from the outside. The person is exercising, saving, building, learning. Same as every previous attempt, but the internal architecture is different. The environment has been designed. The minimum viable action has been defined. The wall protocols have been planned. The accountability has been established. The honeymoon ends. The dip arrives. The boredom wall appears. And for the first time, the person doesn't experience the boredom as a signal to quit. They experience it as a stage they expected. They execute the variation protocol. The boredom passes. The plateau wall arrives. They shift the metrics. The plateau becomes visible progress again. The identity wall surfaces. They reduce to the minimum. The micro-evidence accumulates. The identity begins to update. And somewhere around month 4 or 5, something shifts that motivation never produced. The behavior stops feeling like effort. It starts feeling like who they are. The structure held long enough for the identity to update, and the updated identity now sustains the behavior the way the old identity sustained the quitting. Automatically, without motivation, without willpower, without the morning pep talk or the evening affirmation, the person didn't become more disciplined. They became someone different. And the becoming happened not through the dramatic transformation the motivational industry promised, but through the quiet accumulation of evidence that the brain couldn't ignore. Closing thoughts, the thing motivation never told you. The motivational industry sold you a lie wrapped in adrenaline. The lie was that the feeling of motivation is the thing that produces change. That if you could feel it intensely enough and frequently enough, you would transform your life. That the people who succeeded felt it and the people who failed didn't. That the solution to your pattern of starting and stopping was a more powerful dose of the same emotional spike that had already failed you 100 times. The truth is quieter, less marketable, impossible to sell in a 90-second video with dramatic music and a man screaming at you to want it more. Impossible to package as a daily dose delivered to your phone. Impossible to monetize as a recurring subscription because the truth, once understood and implemented, doesn't need repeating. The truth is that the people who follow through don't feel more motivated than you do. They feel the same boredom you feel, hit the same plateau you hit, face the same identity resistance you face, wake up on the same cold mornings with the same desire to stay in bed and the same internal negotiation about whether today is the day they take a break. They feel the same reluctance, the same fatigue, the same pull toward the easier path. The difference is not what they feel, it's what they built around what they feel. They built the structure that carries behavior through the valleys where motivation dies and the brain begins its exit strategy. They built the environment that makes the default action the desired action, so the decision is already made before the reluctant morning arrives. They built the minimum viable action that survives the worst day, the lowest energy day, the day when everything feels pointless, and the voice says quit, and the only thing between continuing and stopping is the fact that 5 minutes is so small that even the quitting voice can't argue against it. They built the wall protocols that transform predictable obstacles into expected stages that were planned for months ago when the thinking was clear. They built the accountability that adds external weight to the brain's internal calculation, at the exact moment when the internal weight has already evaporated. They built the system, and the system works when motivation doesn't, which is most of the time, which is every Tuesday and every Thursday and every rainy morning and every tired evening and every day that isn't the day after the inspirational video. You don't need more motivation. You've had enough motivation to start 1,000 things. The starting was never the problem. The problem was always the structure, or rather, the absence of the structure, the gap between the spark and the fire, the missing architecture that would have held the behavior in place long enough for it to stop being something you do and start being something you are. Build the system tonight, not Monday, tonight. Pick one behavior you've quit before. 1. Define the minimum viable action. Set up the environment. Plan for the boredom wall. Plan for the plateau. Plan for the identity resistance. Tell one person. And then do the minimum, just the minimum, not the maximum, not the impressive version. The version so small your brain doesn't bother resisting it. Do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Not because you're motivated, because the system is running, and systems don't need motivation. They just need someone to show up and execute the minimum. That's it. That's the whole secret the motivational industry didn't want you to know. Show up, do the minimum. Let the identity up.